I am Pastor Ben. I'm the high school pastor here, and so I only get to preach every once in a while, and I'm so honored every time that Pastor Tim and Pastor Rex ask me to. The work that they do preaching week in and week out, that is hard work, and so they let me come every once in a while, and I love that they let me do it. And like I said, I'm the high school pastor, and this thing has started happening with my high school group. Like, I have a lot of responsibilities at this church. I do a lot of different things, and when I don't show up on Sunday morning to youth group, they start calling me absentee father next time that I'm not there. And so I want all of you to do a favor for me, because I have to check in to let them see that I'm actually here. So I'm doing this on Facebook, and I wanted to prove to them that I'm actually here. So wave to the high school group. There we go. All right. So now they'll see me on Facebook, and they'll see, Ben was actually there. He was in the service. So, but I'm so excited to be here because there's nowhere else that I would be, because this is where God's called me to be. It's so obvious to me that God has called me and my family here to this church at this time to try and be an encouragement to the body. And there's no place that gives me more joy than being where God has called me. And the reason I know that God has called me here is because every morning when I wake up and I say, God, what do you have for me? He always tells me to preach one thing. One message. And it's awesome. It's what I get to do for my high schoolers. So every time I see them, we meet on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday nights. Every time I'm there with them, I tell them the same message. And I think eventually it's going to get to be like, come on, Ben. Just banging against their head with the same message. And once they start getting annoyed with me for saying it, I feel like I'm starting to do the right thing. And it's this. I tell them every time I see them that I honestly believe that following Jesus Christ is the best possible thing you can do with your life. I think there's nothing better than you can do with your life. And I think it for a lot of reasons. I think that Jesus Christ's philosophy is a good one, and that if every human being on earth followed that philosophy, it would transform the world for the better. I believe that worshiping God brings healing. I believe there's so much great things to following Christ. And it's brought to a much more poignant reality in times like these, in times of tragedy. We've had the tragedy in Paris, in Tunisia, and then not long ago in Kenya, and all around the world we have things like that popping up. This violence, these ideologies of hate that are showing up. And so often we find ourselves wondering, where is our hope? And to me, I can honestly say my hope is in Jesus Christ. And then it's also the case that there are these... There's just a general sense of anxiety about our society. Just this last weekend, I was at our men's retreat, our church men's retreat, and there were a group of us. We got together, we had a ton of fun. There may or may not have been some poker played, and I may or may not have been terrible at it. So I lost everything that I put in the pot. We were playing just for chips, so I just lost chips. But, so yeah, if any of you are good at poker, you want to invite me, because you'll clean me out. But one of the things we did while we were there is we took kind of a quick survey of what are the things that cause the most anxiety among the men of our church. The biggest worries, both spiritual and just general worries. And it was kind of one thing. There were two that were overriding everything else, but it really comes down to one thing. We were worried about the direction that our society is headed. A lot of us said, I'm worried for my kids, but I'm worried because I don't know what the future is going to be like for them. And we're worried about the global society. The fact that there is it feels like at an increasing rate, these terrorist attacks, these things that just are shocking in their violence and their dehumanization. And a lot of us were saying we're worried. And for me, as a youth pastor, I see that and I care a lot about that, but it's brought even into more poignant reality for me, seeing the lives that our high schoolers have to lead, and our middle schoolers, and younger. I work with some of the younger kids sometimes too. And one of the things that Pastor Tim said in one of his talks, it was just sort of an offhanded comment. He said that God is here with us in this garbage dump where we live. And a lot of you know that we go to Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and we serve in a garbage dump. And I was just there in August, and we're already planning the next team that's going to go. And I was in an actual garbage dump, and I saw how terrible that is to see children living in a garbage dump, trying to eke out a living through recycling pieces of cardboard and plastic. And I thought of Pastor Tim's description of this society and the ways in which it is a garbage dump. And I thought, how is that true? And I thought about how easy it is for a kid to get bullied at school. Now, especially with so much of their life being online, to where people can look it up and they can comment in places that you can't find, and they can have so much of their life. It's just constant now, to where when you're bullied, people can get to you at every moment of the day. You never get to escape anymore. And then you see kids who are discouraged, and they're able to find these places where there are these ideologies of hatred that are just so much stronger than anything you could imagine. You used to have to go join some group or find some person. Now you can join a chat room and you can see and read things that will just destroy your life. And there are young kids who end up there. And by the time they're in high school, it starts to take over their lives. And so, there's so many great things going on as well. I mean, every Sunday we see kids up here playing bass, and we have our youth band come up and play, and our youth is down there meeting. There's also a lot of great things going on and a lot to be excited about. But, in a sense, a lot of the places where our kids spend a lot of their time are garbage dumps. And I find myself saying, what hope do I have? What chance do I have to fix this? How can I do something? And I'm a pretty action-oriented guy, and I want to be able to do something. I want to be able to do things that make a difference. And so a lot of times when we get in that place, we find ourselves saying, if I only had the right picture of God, if I could just see him, if I heard a voice, and if it was in the Bible, how God would be like, "Hey, you guy," and I'd be like, "Huh?" And he would say, "It's going to be okay." I'd be, "Okay, all right, good. I can go do it. I can go do the work that I have to do." And this is true for a lot of us, especially going into this winter season. It's a really hard time for a lot of us. We remember some of those memories that we used to have that are just not going to be the same in the future. Maybe we've lost a loved one, or if we're sick, or if a loved one's sick. It becomes more painful during this winter time. And for some of us, it's just the sun isn't out as much, and that's hard. I know for me, when I was in college, my grades always took a little dip in the winter. I think that happens to everybody. And so this is a time when a lot of times we find ourselves saying, if only I had that picture of God, if only an angel would come and talk to me and be like, "Hey, God's real, you're doing the right thing, you're great, just keep on going." Then I feel like a lot of us could say, "All right, I can go do this thing." But a lot of us don't have it. And so I wanted to talk about a story in the Bible that helps us see that picture. And the reason why I picked this one is because that desire for the clear picture of God, that's a desire that the disciples had as well. And so what I love about this story, and I'm talking from Matthew chapter 17, it's the story of the transfiguration of Jesus. A lot of times, we wish that our life was more like the Bible. And this is a story where our lives are like the Bible, because the disciples wanted that picture of God. They wanted that clarity. And so, with that said, what God gives us is always a bit surprising. And so I'll tell you a bit about it. But first I need to do some kind of preamble to lead up to this, to explain why the transfiguration story is so important. So this is some stuff that's important to know. First of all, the transfiguration. It's a story that I'll tell in a minute, but what happens before it is Jesus is with his disciples, and he does one of the most amazing miracles in his whole life. And this whole sort of arc of things is happening right before Jesus starts the difficult part, where he goes into Jerusalem and he faces his trials and ultimately his death. But there is this high point, and it's when he feeds the 5,000. He and his disciples, he's teaching to thousands of people, and his disciples say, hey, it's getting late. We should probably start to let these people go so that they can eat. And Jesus is like, no, man, we're doing too good now. We got to feed them. And so the disciples are like, okay, it's going to cost a lot of money, and you're a homeless dude, so how are you going to pay for it? And Jesus says, well, what do you have? And he says, I've got fish and I've got loaves. Or, we've got some fish and some loaves. And Jesus says, good enough, bring them to me. Just bring them to me. And he does this miracle where miraculously, and we don't know how, there was enough food for everybody to eat. And so this had to be a really high point in the disciples' lives. It would have taken hours to go and distribute this food. It wasn't just like a bam, like, oh wow, that was kind of a cool thing. It was like a all day long, you're out like, this is still a miracle, guys. This miracle's still going on. It's got to be really great for them. And so shortly after that, Jesus gets in a discussion with his disciples, and he says, so who do the people think that I am? And they all kind of say like answers that are moderately safe. They're like, you are Elijah, come back to bring back the kingdom of Israel, which is a big thing, but it still is kind of safe. And they say like, well, some say that you're a great prophet, and some say you're a great teacher. And Peter, and for those of you who are familiar with the scriptural narrative of the Gospels, you'll know Peter is a little bit of a dunce. Sometimes he says stuff that just aren't quite on. And so the disciples know this about the guy, and he stands up to speak, and everyone's like, oh no, here it comes. And Peter says, Jesus, you are the Christ who's going to come and make peace on all the world, and there's going to be a kingdom, and we're going to be strong kings and rulers, and you're going to make everything better. And everyone's like, oh no. And Jesus goes, good. And they're like, what? Peter said the right thing? And he's like, yeah, he said the right thing. But I'm going to tell you one more thing. Not only that, all of that great stuff, but also, I'm going to go into Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And they're like, wait a minute. That doesn't sound right. You just said all the good stuff and then this other thing. Jesus took it and kind of flopped it on his head. And Peter, he stands up and he says, no way. Jesus, you just said all the good stuff. You're not going to die. And Jesus comes at him real hard, and he says, get behind me, Satan. You're tempting me to not go in the way that God has planned for me. And so this is right before the transfiguration, when Jesus goes up on this mountain. And what I love about this story is it starts in chapter 17, and it says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. After 6 days, if you are familiar with the Bible, or just Christianity in general, you would know that the Bible starts off and there are pretty significant 6 days that happen at the start of it. It says that the universe was created in 6 periods of time. And the word that it uses is days. It says in 6 days the world was created. And it says that God hovered over the chaos before the creation. And then in the first day there was light. And he says all of that. And so we know that the people reading this would know that 6 days means the fulfillment of a thing. It means it's the right amount of time. And so when we're reading, after 6 days, Jesus takes them up on a hike, we know that this is something big that's going to happen. This is important. Something has been fulfilled, and we're about to see the big thing. But we also know that Peter had to be quaking in his boots this whole 6-day hike, because he just had Jesus call him Satan. I don't know about you, but if any of my friends called me Satan, I'd be pretty upset. But if Jesus called me Satan, he says a lot of pretty cool things, and he's pretty right all the time. I would be freaking out. And so he's probably, kicking rocks in the back as the other guys are hiking. Oh man, I'm a dummy. What's he going to say to me when I get to the top of the mountain? And so they're hiking up, and he had to be sweating it out the whole time. And once they start to get up to the top, this amazing thing happens. Just instantly, bam, there's this flash of light. And it's coming out of Jesus. And I'll read the story because the way it's illustrated is so beautiful. It says, he takes with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves, where he was transfigured before them. His face shone like a light, and his clothes became white as the light. And there appeared next to them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And this had to be just a crazy experience for them. It had to just be absolutely insane, because think about what this actually means. A lot of times we read this story and we think, oh, cool story. But let's actually get into sort of the mindset of where they were at. Because these disciples, they would have known about this Jesus guy. They would have heard the rumors about how he was born, about how his mom got pregnant by someone who was not her dad. And she says it was God, but we all know better. Come on. That's the sort of rumors that would have spread about Jesus among the kids in the schoolyard, right? And they would have heard about how he started teaching, and then he called them, and they say, there's something about this guy, I'm going to follow him. And that was like a military deployment. They went out and they bunked together. They all slept in the same places. They hiked. They were outdoors. They were camping together. They went into towns where there were people who hated them, and Jesus would come in and be like, there are demons here. Demons, go away. Bam! And it would be gone, and the disciples would be like, yeah, we got him. And this is their guy. They're following him. It's like a military platoon, and they're out doing God's work, the work of the kingdom of God. And they also know that his philosophy is amazing. They know it's this great thing that's worth following. And you look at what Jesus taught. It really is amazing. See, a lot of times we look at Jesus, and we as Christians will look at the divinity side first. We sing songs about him and things like that. But rarely do we really consider the humanity side. The fact that what he taught is itself an amazing thing. He taught that violence is wrong. And we know that there are times when you have to stand up to violence, and you stand up to evil in the world, and there are places in the Bible where God's people went to war. We know that that's part of the world we live in, but we also know what was never God's plan. People killing each other was never anything that God wanted. And Jesus taught that. He says life is valuable. And he says that every single one of you, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done or what's been done to you, no matter how you look, you're all made in God's image. And you have value, infinite value, because you are a child of God. That's what he taught. And that philosophy itself is enough to completely revolutionize the world. And you look at what Jesus' disciples have done underneath that philosophy. They've created orphanages and schools and universities, and they've healed people who are sick. They've done so many great things. This philosophy itself is good. And so they're following this guy, and they're like, yeah, Jesus, he's a great teacher. He teaches some stuff that's going to change the world, and it's going to be awesome. And they feel like they're on the cutting edge of this revolution. And then, bam, something else happens. A flash of light. And these 2 dead prophets show up there, and they're talking to Jesus. And the disciples do something which makes a lot of sense. They freak out. They get terrified. Well, the Bible says there's this word that doesn't translate very well in English, but it intensifies emotion. And what it says is they were exceedingly violently scared, which makes a lot of sense. Because not only did Jesus start glowing and dead guys start talking to him, there's this cloud that comes, and this voice comes out of heaven and says, "This is my son, with him I am well pleased." It had to sound like that. It just had to. It had to be like a big scary voice. And so they do this thing that makes a lot of sense. They hit the dirt. They face down on the ground, and they just are like, God, or whatever, I'm here. Let's do this. And Peter's response is really awesome, because just not long ago, he had been called Satan, and so he's really nervous about what he's saying. And so he comes to Jesus and he's like, Jesus, Lord, let me get that right. Lord, well, it's good that we're here. What if I make a shelter? One first for you, but then for these other two guys. How about we do that? And then that voice comes and it's like, okay, forget that. And he's just like down. And that's the way the story goes. But then the next part that happens is just amazing. Because Jesus takes a step forward, reaches out his hand, and he touches him on the head. And he says, don't be afraid. It's me. And they look up, and the guys are gone, and Jesus isn't glowing anymore. And Jesus says, all right, let's go. And that's it. That's the story of the Transfiguration. It's not the way that you would expect that little moment to end. You'd expect there would be this big thing and Jesus would commission them and give them like Holy Spirit armor to where they could go out and like use a Holy Spirit weapon and kill demons, and like you imagine like some great thing happens, but it doesn't. He touches them and he says, let's go. But there's a lot for us to unpack in this passage. For one, the word it uses for touch. There are different ways that you could say touch someone, but the word it uses is one that's associated with healing. When Jesus would come to someone and touch them and make them well. It was also used in ceremonies, so there's like almost this religious connotation of Jesus touching them and healing them. And when he does, what do they see? They just see him there. There's another thing that's kind of cool about this passage, and it's the fact that Moses and Elijah were there. And what the story, it goes on to explain this. The disciples see that and they wonder, what does this mean? What does it mean that Moses and Elijah are there? And this is how it explains it. They were terrified, and eventually they ask Jesus these questions, and they say, why? What does this mean? I thought Elijah was coming, and Elijah was there with you. And Jesus says, to be sure, Elijah will come and restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah has already come, which is confusing. I don't think many of us are going to read that and be like, oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I get that. Sure. It's a little bit confusing. And that's the point, is this amazing moment would have confused them, and so they leave with some questions. And so Jesus kind of explains. He explains that, you know, all of this tradition that you've heard, he's using a formula, you have heard, but I say to you. He says, all of this past religion that you've had, the prophets, the prophecies about things coming, Moses, Elijah, the story of Moses going up on a mountain and seeing God face to face and having that light. And then the story of Elijah going up on a mountain and hearing God's voice in a whisper in the wind. Those stories, he says, I'm standing right in line with those stories. That's why they're here, to show who I am. Right there. And it says that this path is one that I'm not taking you off somewhere else. I'm not starting a new religion. I'm not starting some new thing. With me is the way to go. But there's more going on here than just that, because the word it uses to describe the transfiguration is a Latin word. This is, in the Bible, it's written in Greek. And in Greek it says metamorphe. And we're familiar with the idea of metamorphosis, like a caterpillar who goes into a chrysalis and then turns into goop, and then miraculously it's a butterfly. That's not what Jesus did. It wasn't like he just slowly started to turn into light. It was like, bam, instantaneous, amazing, crazy thing. But there's a word that some of you who are from our church might be familiar with, meta. Meta is a preposition, and it means with. It means together and underneath. We in our church often refer to ourselves as a meta church. And what that means is we have a lot of diverse communities, but together we see God with us all at the same time. And even in this room, there's a lot of diversity here, but together we see God in our midst. And so that's what meta means, with. But what it's saying is that glory, that light of God, it was right there the whole time. It wasn't something that was beamed on him from outside. It was meta. It was within him. And then, bam, in a moment, it becomes visible. And so let's think about what that means for his disciples. These guys who loved him, who knew him, who followed him, and they were following this teaching that was good. And then this light happens, and they look up, and they realize, we so underestimated what we were seeing. Because they would have remembered the stories in the Bible of how it says, in the beginning, God hovered over the chaos. And we all know the chaos of our lives and the chaos of this world and the ways in which it's broken. And they knew that too, and they see there was light. Bam! In a moment, in an instant, there. And they realize we're not just looking at a guy, we're looking at the one who hovered over creation in the beginning. We're looking at the one who stands in line with the tradition of the prophets, and through him, we're going to see amazing things come. Because Moses and Elijah, when they went up on the mountain, they saw a light. But when Jesus went up on the mountain, he was the light. He was the one that Moses and Elijah were looking at and talking with. They were looking at him, the light. And the disciples are looking at him, the light, saying, whoa, we misunderstood what's going on here. And then look at what Jesus does next. He touches them and he says, don't be afraid. Let's go. It's this beautiful moment where underneath the surface, God reveals himself as so much more. And he says, we're going to keep going. And I just love it. It's an amazing passage to me. And so the story keeps going. You'd think that it would go out and they would start some amazing thing, but they kind of just keep going as normal. They go down the mountain, and this is what it says. It says, they came to a crowd, and a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures, and he has suffered greatly. He often falls into the fire and the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. And then Jesus does this crazy thing. He says, he gets mad at him. He says, oh, you perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. And then Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed. There's a lot going on in this passage, but I think it's important for us to realize something here. So often for us, we wish we had that ultimate picture of God, and if we had that clarity, that power, I'd be able to do something. Me, as a youth pastor, I see kids who are hurting, and I say, man, I wish I just had some proof, some empirical evidence that God was real, because that would give me the strength to go and do what I know I have to do. And it reminded me of this story that I actually heard last night. We were sitting around talking, and I found out that my dear and beautiful and lovely wife, Becca, when she was a child, owned a taxidermied cat, which is disgusting. And she used to walk around with it, and then finally her parents came to her and they're like, Becca, that's gross, and it's creeping the family out. You got to get rid of the cat. So often we look at faith and we say, if only I had that picture, that would be enough. But that's like walking around with a taxidermied cat. Faith is meant to be alive. If you walked around with just this moment of flashing bright light all the time, that's not how God made us to live. He made us to walk with him. And so that's what we see happening with the disciples. They're there trying to do this thing and to have this power, and it's just not clicking and it's not working. We know that experience. But he's saying, you got to follow me. And so let's read on. It says, then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? And he replied, which is a hard thing for us to hear, he said, it's because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will happen. He says, there is nothing that will be impossible for you. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit, because there are some things for us to think about. For one, the word that they're using to say we have no power, and you'll notice that I'm changing that. That's not what our translation says. It's because the word is dunamis, which is what we get the word dynamite from. Some of you maybe who've been around church for a while have heard that before. But what they're saying is, why are we without power? We have no power. We have no strength to do anything. And the guy said, your disciples have no power. And they say, why do we have no power? And Jesus does this cool thing. He says, with nothing, you will be without power. He says, in every obstacle and circumstance you come to, you're going to have power. You're going to be able to overcome anything if you just had a little speck of faith. And we think, all right, Jesus, did you see what they were doing? They were trying to cast out a demon. I think that they've got some faith to do that. Like, when I see that, that's not the kind of thing I do every day. Like, walk up to somebody and be like, demons, come out. You need faith to do something like that. What is he talking about? And so for me, with my small problems, how do I have the faith of a mustard seed? Like, if they didn't have the faith of a mustard seed, what is mine? It's like faith of less than a grain of sand or something. And so it's important for us to realize some things about what's going on here. First off, what we see from the Transfiguration is that faith is not believing in the big, strong power thing. It's not that moment where they fell on their face and they saw for the first time and said, wow, he's so much more than I could have imagined. Faith is walking with him down the mountain. We don't put our faith is not just the power to do a thing. Faith is trust in a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And we look at what the disciples were doing. They were trying to do this miracle, but they weren't doing the most important thing. They weren't coming to Jesus Christ with it. In the Bible, what it says is this. After he goes on that rant, Jesus says, bring the boy here to me. And the words are the same words. It's a direct quote from what he said about the fish and the loaves. He says, bring him here. And when they say that, you know that the disciples were like, it's just like then. It's going to be okay. What Jesus is saying is faith is to come to me. Faith is to come to me. And so often we think if I only had this sign, I'd have the faith. A lot of people who grow up in the church grow up saying, like, okay, God, if you're real, move the stage just an inch. And we try and use the force and we... Nothing. And we say if we had that sign, it'd be enough. Jesus knew that even for the disciples to see everything revealed in that moment of power, that just underneath, he's the one. That still isn't enough. And so Jesus does something even better. He walks with them down the mountain. He walks with them down the slope. And when they bring him their sick, he heals them. And when they're mourning, they come to him and he mourns with them. And he goes through life as a human being. And he goes through all of the trials and frustrations and temptations that they go through. And he goes all the way to Jerusalem, where he's arrested as a prisoner of the state. And he's put on trial for crimes against their religion. And he's killed. He goes through everything that his disciples go through, even to the point of death. And he comes through it on the other side. The miracle of the Transfiguration is not who God is at that moment. He's been that the whole time. The miracle of the Transfiguration is that he goes with them every step of the way afterwards. So often in our lives, we find ourselves saying, how do I cope with the struggles of this world? How do I cope with the difficulties of this world? How do I deal with the fact that I don't know what the future is going to be like for my kids? How do I deal with the fact that I don't know whether this election is going to do what I think it needs to do for our country? How do we deal with that? Maybe if I had enough faith, I'd be able to change things and make it happen. Me as a youth pastor, when I see a kid who's depressed, how do I make a difference in that kid's life? It's not something I'm going to do. I can do a lot of great things and be a lot of great things, but what I need to do is I need to bring that kid to Jesus Christ. And when I look at our society, what it takes is not some amazing faith and sign that says, I'm going to make a big shining light and put on my fancy armor and go to battle. It's, I need to bring this society to Jesus Christ. I need to bring my coworkers to Jesus Christ. I need to bring myself to Jesus Christ. Because the best possible thing you can do with your life is to follow Jesus Christ. And the beautiful thing about it is it's a great philosophy. And if it were purely a human philosophy, I honestly believe it would end all wars and poverty. I honestly believe that. If every human being followed Jesus Christ, we would not have any of the problems we deal with today. But it's so much more than that. Because it is the teachings and the truth of the one who hovered over the waves in the beginning, over the chaos that was before there was anything. And in a beautiful moment, there's a flash of light. And all things come into being. It's that one who then steps into our world. And maybe some of us have seen those moments of miracles. I could ask you guys to raise your hands, and some of you have seen someone who has been healed. We have testimonies about it all the time. Some of you can say, I myself have seen a miracle that makes no sense other than that God had a hand in it. Some of you can say, I know who I was, I know who I am now. That's a miracle and I know God's real. But some of us are still waiting on that miracle. And here's what I have to say. We are standing in the tradition of a God who is so powerful. But it's not his power that we follow. It's the person of the one who walks with us every step of the way. And what the Bible says is that after Jesus died, he came back. And he didn't come back as the kingdom they expected, at least not right away. He came back as fire, as light that came and lived inside of each one of his disciples. It lived among the people there, just like it lives among us now. Just like we can stand up and we can worship God and we can raise up our hands and we can say, God, I praise you because you're here. That spirit, that light illuminates us too and goes with us every step of the way. And we know that this isn't that the story doesn't end with the sadness and the depression. We know that God is stronger than the direction our society is going and that he's got great plans. Because what the Bible says is that what started with a light is going to end with a light. The kingdom of God is coming. And we know that Jesus Christ, we believe he was raised from the dead. And we believe that that means that there is a resurrection for the dead in the future. And that there will someday, somehow, and we don't know how or what it will look like, there's going to be peace on earth. That's coming. And in the meantime, we know he's going to walk with us every step of the way. And so, we have a mission. We have a call on our life. Each and every individual one of you has a call on your life. And that is to walk with Jesus Christ and to live in faith. Maybe just a little faith to where you can say, hey, if you come with me to Jesus Christ, it's going to change your life. Because I know that the best possible thing you can do with your life is follow Jesus. And as we do that, it's going to change things. This church has a call on its life to go out into our society and say, hey, if you follow me to Jesus Christ, it's the best possible thing you can do with your life, and it's going to change things. And we do it knowing who we stand with a good God who's with us, who loves us, and who has seen every single thing that we've gone through. He's gone through it himself, and he's made it out the other side, shining and bright with God's glory. Please stand with me for the closing benediction.